Simple questions that you would think of. What type of logging techniques do you use? What kind of best management practices do you use? Are you familiar with logging in Maryland's critical areas? So I'll talk about that in a few slides, but we have some very state-specific natural resource protection laws that can have big impacts on how and what you can remove from your property. And so if you're within 1,000 feet of tidal water in Maryland, you're within Maryland's critical area, and you're going to want to make sure that your logging company understands all that and those restrictions. Important question, what form of liability insurance do you currently possess? What does that insurance policy cover? Those are just some general overview questions that you might want to keep in mind to protect yourself. Regardless of, sort of where you start with this, we created this little visual image here to give you some ideas of the different roles in this process. So if you're the landowner and you're working with a forester, you're going to be working with that forester to establish goals for the property. The forester should be asking you, what are your long-term goals for this property? And then they will help you create a forest management plan, a forest stewardship plan. I'm using those terms synonymously, that will reflect those goals. If you're using a logger, as the landowner, you're going to want to make sure that the logging contract is appropriate and provides you enough protection. And then you're going to want to monitor that logging up as it goes on the property. And the logger is going to serve to remove the forest products. A forester can work with a logger, so you can have your own consulting forester that will help convey your desires for the property, any concerns that you may have. We have a service in Maryland that's important to keep in mind if you're wanting to do your own removal. It's called Call Before You Cut. It's going to help you make informed decisions about timber harvesting. So I provided you the information there. It's complimentary. So I throw that out there as a consideration for folks if they're deciding to go ahead and harvest their own timber. Okay, the Forest Stewardship Plan. It's an important plan. It's the primary document that's going to allow you to enter into the financial incentive programs that I'll go over in a second. So if you are interested in trying to figure out, how you could potentially make some income off your forest, you're definitely going to want to start with a Forest Stewardship Plan. It's a long-term plan, so it's created for up to 15 years. However, you can revise it every 5 years as circumstances change if needed. And both the initial creation of the plan and any additional revisions should be done by a licensed forester, so either a private or a DNR employed forester. If you're seeking to use a DNR service forester, there are minimum acreage requirements for that. So if you have a small amount of forested land on your farm, you may not be able to take advantage of having the public state employed forester create that plan. However, there are specific private consulting foresters who will help you even with small tracts of land. So you're going to need to go and speak. I would start with your the local state forester and see if your property qualifies. And then there are, a schedule of fees associated with the preparation of that plan. I provided you an image of a map on one of the plans because the plans typically contain goals and objectives for the property for profitability and environmental stewardship and maps. The maps are going to denote property boundaries, boundaries of forested areas and croplands, and they're going to assign, what areas you're going to be using for recreation versus farming and that type of thing. The plan will include a forest inventory. So if your intent is to harvest trees, the plan is going to indicate where you have valuable timber. It's going to there will be a table describing each forest stand and the forester's harvesting recommendations. And like I said, it's going to be a chronological plan with descriptions of activities for a 10 or 15-year period. So the good news is that there is cost assistance available for planning and management of forested acres on farmland. There's federal and state programs that are available to defray some costs. Again, a good place to start with what best cost share options are available to you is with your local DNR service forester. Once you understand your options, the actual application may go through either the Maryland Forest Service or NRCS or the Farm Service Agency, just depending on which program you apply to. And then the service forester can serve as sort of the inspector of the practice and ensure that there's proper implementation going on. So here's some examples of cost share assistance for planning and management. There's the Woodlands Incentive Program, EQIP program, which I'm sure most farmers are familiar with, and then there's CREP program as well, and some eligible expenses related to forest management, invasive control, tree planting, habitat management, riparian forest buffers, that type of thing. Okay, so getting to some of the incentives or the ways that you can use your forested acres to provide some additional farm income. Using a forest conservation management agreement is important if you're trying to take advantage of some property tax incentives. So a forest conservation management agreement is a legal contract between the landowner and the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. In order to take advantage of this specific benefit, you have to have a minimum of 5 acres of forested land. In the forest conservation management agreement, the landowner agrees to manage their forest according to the management plan. So basically it takes that stewardship plan that we were talking about before, which was, functions similar to a conservation plan. Is an in-depth plan that provides a lot of guidance, but is not necessarily, legally enforceable or, that type of thing, unless you have a forest conservation management agreement. So the forest conservation management agreement says, you've agreed to implement the steps in that management plan on this property for the next 15 years. There are some fees involved, and then if you qualify, your property tax assessment is frozen at a low rate, regardless of where your property is located in Maryland for the duration of the contract. So if you want more information about that, I provided a link there for you for DNR's website. And if anybody wants me to email them this presentation following the webinar, I'm happy to do that so that you can have better access to these links, because I know some of them are long. There's also another property tax incentive called the Woodland Assessment Program. So folks get a little bit confused about this with how woodlands and the agricultural use assessment pair up. So I'll try to break that down for you. So woodlands are eligible to receive the agricultural use assessment, that ag property use assessment, when it's part of a larger parcel that's determined to be actively used for agriculture. So if you have a farm, the majority of the farm is actively used for agriculture and you have a small amount of woodland, typically your county assessor's office will take those woodland properties and find that they're eligible to also receive that ag use assessment. There's another provision that allows separate tracts of woodlands, if they're greater than 5 acres in size, to receive the ag use assessment if the property owner develops a forest conservation management agreement. So similar to the last one, if you have separate tracts of woodland, you enter into that forest conservation management agreement, you can also take advantage of that, even if they're not part of a actively used farm. An income tax incentive. We have an income tax incentive in Maryland. It allows woodland owners to deduct double the cost for reforestation and timber stand improvement practices from your federal adjusted gross income on your Maryland tax return. And that deduction is applicable for approved practices on properties with a total forest ownership of 3 to 1,000 acres. And I gave you that citation there. So if this is something you think you might be eligible for, I would recommend you talk to your accountant about that. Easement programs. I won't go too in-depth into conservation easements, but there are a number of conservation easement programs, both state programs and easement programs through private land trusts that value forested land. So an easement, in case you're not really familiar, is it permanently limits the uses on the parcel in question, and it's done to protect conservation values. So because of the environmental benefits that forested acres on farms serve, it's often attractive for the folks who hold these conservation easements to acquire a piece of property that has forested land on it. If you're talking about donating that easement, a qualified donation of a qualified conservation easement is tax deductible, which can be a big benefit for folks. By contrast, you can also sell a conservation easement, and you can do that to preserve forested land and also provide additional farm income. Another way that might not necessarily pop into folks' minds when they're thinking about how I could potentially benefit from this forested land on my property is taking advantage of some of the emerging opportunities with ecosystem services markets. So forest mitigation banking is a concept that, or a program really, sort of an economic tool that occurs when developers have to develop a certain piece of property. So I included this picture on this slide to kind of give you that feel. You see there's residential development in that picture butting up into natural resource areas. Well, let's say the developer that developed that subdivision there needed to replant trees as a legal requirement of, getting development approval. But in some cases, developers are not able to plant those trees on site. Sometimes if there's just not enough room. They still have requirements to do that planting for that mitigation for trees that are removed. And so some counties in Maryland have established banks for that, whereby a developer can go into a bank created by the county and find properties such as ag land that are more well suited for planting trees. So if you have a small forested area on your property and you're interested in having it increased, maybe it's a low productive area of your farm and you think, that would be better if I could have some more trees planted there, it might be something that you could take advantage of. Craig Highfield from Alliance for the Bay has been working with farmers on this specific project and has had some success in getting farmers some income and making sure that these forest mitigation bankings are functioning well. And so if that's something you're interested in, or if you have land that you think would be appropriate, if you're in a county where you have, urban development and then you've still got a lot of farmland, you probably would be a good candidate for that. Not all counties have them. It just depends county by county, and then counties have different requirements as well. But Craig knows a lot of those details and would be a good contact. And then nutrient trading. Nutrient trading, still in its infancy in Maryland, but definitely starting. There are some pilot projects that are starting this year, so that's another potential opportunity. There will be a presentation by experts on ecosystem trading at that Agriculture and Environmental Law Conference on November 14th. So if you want to hear more about this, I would suggest you register for our conference. Talking about the legal framework and laws that you need to be aware of in Maryland. So we have the Forest Conservation Act in Maryland. That was a law that came about in the early 90s. It aims to protect Maryland's forested lands from development and degradation. It requires developers to replace trees cut down during development for projects exceeding approximately an acre. It may require long-term protection of some priority areas or planting or replanting, either on-site or off-site, depending on the project. Folks get a little bit confused sometimes about the Forest Conservation Act because it's a state law, but it's actually administered on the local level. So local governments adopt their own county forest conservation program, and then they're the ones that actually do the implementation of Maryland's Forest Conservation Act. There is an exemption for agriculture. So any agricultural activity that does not result in a change in land use category, so as long as what you're doing on the land doesn't change it from being agricultural, including support buildings and other related structures built using acceptable best management practices, are not subject to this act. So if you're just, adding a manure storage structure or something, along those lines, and it's still remaining a farm, you would not be subject to this act. And then the critical area protection law, I referenced this before, so there's a map there to just kind of show you an overview in Talbot County of our critical areas. But Forested areas that are within a 1,000-foot boundary of state tidal waters or wetlands are considered critical areas in Maryland. And if forested lands are located within the critical area, it's really important to work with a forester or a logger who's familiar with this area, with this law, because harvesting and forestry issues within the critical area are actually governed by the Critical Area Act, not the Forest Conservation Act. Last but not least, we all know that forested areas can have a lot of recreational value, and it's important to consider those uses as well. So, you know, whether you're doing it personally or whether you're thinking about leasing out your forested areas for other folks to enjoy recreationally. So I gave you a little summary of some of our hunting laws here in Maryland. So if you're going to have folks hunting on your property, they need your written permission as the landowner, and DNR has a simple to use form for that. Hunters are typically liable for damage caused while hunting, and landowners are typically not liable for accidental injuries. However, still a very good practice to have a good hunting lease. If anybody needs resources for that, I'm happy to provide it. So if you're going to be using your forested land for recreational uses, important to have a lease to protect yourself and make sure that your liability exposure is reduced to the greatest extent possible. And then also wanted to point out the Recreational Use Statute. So this is a law we have in Maryland that protects landowners. So if you allow others to use your land for recreational purposes and you do not charge a fee, you enjoy some protection in terms of liability. So you won't be liable for injuries that occur unless you acted maliciously in causing the injury. So that would be a pretty rare instance. So if you're going to have folks on your property, if you're going to let the Boy Scouts or any other group come and enjoy your forested land, important not to charge them anything if you don't need to charge them anything, so that you can enjoy that reduced liability. If you want more information about reducing premises liability, please check out our website. We have a lot of resources on that, videos and written publications. So the University of Maryland Extension's Woodland Stewardship Education Program, it's a great website. It lists upcoming educational events related to forestry on farms. There's recorded webinars, a lot of publications, so I encourage you to check that out if you've never checked it out. Maryland DNR, and that's the primary regulatory agency that's going to be managing all of this, so there's a lot of good resources on their website. The Maryland Forest Association, I provided you with their website. They're an industry organization, but that website also has educational materials, and you can sign up to get a newsletter. And then Forests for the Bay, that's the program through Alliance for the Bay that I referenced before, and they also have some great stuff on their website that would probably help you. Okay. Well, with that, that is what I have to say today about managing forests on farmland. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Very good. Lots of information, Sarah. We'll give everyone a chance to type in any questions that they have. No questions, but Jesse said thank you for a very informative session.
My pleasure.
I learned a whole lot about the forestry industry on Saturday at the seminar with Agnes, so that was fun.
Oh, yeah, good.
Been learning a lot.
Good question. Does the state lean towards conservation of forests? Yes, I think that is definitely a priority of DNR to conserve the existing forested areas that we have left, which is why we have this great resource with our local county foresters, and every county has their own forester to try to help people manage forests and conserve them to the extent possible.
Well, I think it might be, oh, here's one.
If trees line a stream, do they have to remain? That's an interesting question. It's going to depend on the type of stream you're talking about, and it's also going to depend on whether or not the trees lining the stream were funded by an existing government program. So, you know, if you as a landowner or your predecessor received funding in order to plant that riparian buffer, which is a pretty common occurrence, then there would be a contractual obligation there to retain those trees. And then it's going to depend on, you know, the type of stream involved. So if you want to email me with more information about that, Anthony, so I can provide you with a more specific answer, I'm happy to do that.
What rights as a landowner do we have if power lines are to come into a forested area?
Power lines. So typically with the power lines in a forested area, you're going to have an easement on your property from the power company that would allow them to come onto the property to maintain those power lines. Sometimes those easements can be very old, but 9 times out of 10, the power company, you know, whether that be Chop Tank Electric or some predecessor thereof, is going to have recorded an easement on your land, and so they would have the right to come on, and it usually gives them fairly broad rights to come within a certain area and maintain those. There is a video on our website about how to search Maryland land records and find those types of easements, so if that's something that you're curious about, I would encourage you to check out that video, see if you can find that easement. If you're not able to do it because searching property records is not the easiest thing in the world, you can ask a title company in Maryland to run that search for you.
All right, Sarah, I think it's time. I think it's safe to say we can end the session. Thank you for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.